Hey there friends, welcome back to the channel. My name's Alex Leicas, and today I'm going a bit different from what I normally do with my photography. I am not going to be talking about an SLR today. No, I'm going to be talking about a rangefinder. And the rangefinder I'll be reviewing today is the only rangefinder left in my collection, the brilliant Contax IIIa. But as always, let's head back to the studio first. We can do a brief discussion on the history of the camera, a brief tour of the camera itself, and of course, go over the functionality of it, and I will meet you back here in a few.
It all started with a Leica. Well, Oscar Barnack to be exact. Barnack's goal to create a small, easily carried camera that anyone in any condition could carry and use had been a success. Barnack's Leica, produced by Leicas, had also brought 35mm or cinefilm into the mass market in a big way. And Zeiss Ikon wanted a piece of that action. So they turned to the vast resource that was the various camera firms that had created Zeiss Ikon, put together a team headed by Dr. Emanuel Goldberg, who would take on the task of building a 35mm rangefinder that could rival the Leica. Specifically, the Leica II. And in 1932, the Contax would hit the market. And the Contax, well, a little unpolished on the exterior finishes. Let's be honest, it was a brick. But the internals certainly could rival the Leica II. And it mainly came down to the shutter, which topped out at a blistering 1/1000th of a second using brass slats and silk streamers to sort of do a garage door roll-up effect. And compared to the horizontal cloth shutter of the Leica, which topped out at 1/500th of a second, certainly beat it there. Unfortunately, Dr. Goldberg would have to flee Germany for France in 1933, for obvious reasons. But the team kept working, and there are at least 6 known variants of the original Contax, and probably a lot more out there that are unknown. But as I mentioned, the original Contax was unfinished, unpolished. So Zeiss turned to Hubert Nurwin. Nurwin would go on to design an improved copy, which came out in 1936. And that would be the Contax II, which basically remained the original of the Contax in sort of how it worked, but had a much more polished exterior, something a little more familiar to what we know today from Contax rangefinders. And it also maintained that interesting shutter configuration, but this time they were able to get the top speed to 1/1250th of a second, which again, for those days, is pretty darn fast. They also released a second version of the new Contax rangefinder, the Contax III. The biggest difference between the two is the Contax III featured an uncoupled selenium exposure meter to help the photographer. And the rivalry was there. While most working photojournalists preferred the Contax line of cameras, more artistic professional photographers went with the Leica. Of course, World War II kicked off in 1939, and Zeiss Ikon would move to a war footing under the new Third Reich. And history gets dark here. Zeiss would use forced labor from a concentration camp, and they would produce optics and material for the Luftwaffe. But also, that Zeiss got the living daylights bombed out of them. Allied bombing raids basically leveled Dresden. And as the war came to a close in '45, Dresden found itself in the Soviet zone of control. And a lot of what was Zeiss was carried off to various Soviet photographic factories, including the Arsenal factory in the city of Kyiv in Ukraine. And using the pre-war designs of the Contax, they would produce the popular Kiev line of rangefinders. And you could even find Contax parts on those. But the Western Allies also saw a great deal of value in harnessing Germany's photographic industry and snuck out a bunch of Zeiss scientists and engineers and designers and parts and reset them up in Jena and Stuttgart. And it was here that Nerwin began designing a new version of the popular Contax II and Contax III. Taking advantage of new lightweight material, the shutter switched from brass to aluminum, silk streamers for nylon, and generally designed about a camera that was 20% smaller than the pre-war models. The Contax IIIa was released in 1950, and the Contax IIIa was released in 1951. Of course, with a smaller camera, it meant that certain pre-war lenses could no longer be mounted, or they would cause damage to the new camera. But the 1950s also saw a major shift in working photographers. Many, by the end of the decade, were moving towards the SLR system, specifically 1959's Nikon F. And Contax slowly faded into obscurity, with both the 2A and the 3A being stopped in 1961, but their legacy lived on. The Nikon line of rangefinders, right down to the mount, took inspiration from the Contax line of cameras, and the Nikon rangefinders went into the Nikon F. So it lives on in that camera, and more importantly, in the Kiev line of rangefinders, they kept going until 1987. So let's take a closer look at this beautiful piece of mid-century photographic technology from the Germans. And here it is. This is the Contax IIIa. It's a beautiful piece of technology, and it's beautifully designed. One of the nicest looking cameras that I actually own, and if it ever does give up the ghost, it is one that I will be keeping on my shelf. Mostly because it is a historically significant camera, and it just looks nice. Mine dates from 1953, so it is slightly later on in the post-war production, but actual dates of cameras don't really give me any real interest. I just sort of like to date where a camera comes from. Mine came from my good friend John Meadows, who graciously sold this to me several years ago, and it's one that I've never let go of. So let's take a look at the camera itself. Out on the front you have your two windows. You have your main viewfinder window, and then you have your secondary rangefinder. Got the lens on the front, and what makes it interesting is that the focusing helical is actually in the camera, not in the optics, and that will come back to bite a little bit later. The lens release is a little tiny tab just tucked in right up there, and you sort of push it down, and it's a friction, it's a springed piece of metal, and pretty solid. You have your focusing knob up here, and it has an infinity lock, so you simply press that down and you got your focus up here. Up on the top of the camera is your shutter speed selector, and this one has the colored numbers on it. You have your frame counter, your film advance knob, and your shutter release. Over here you have your exposure meter readout, a cold shoe, and over here you have your rewind knob and then the meter adjustment. So you could actually manually adjust your film speed, your aperture, and your shutter, and then you'd simply match the needle up on your exposure meter. And the exposure meter is actually under this neat little thing. Pop it open, and there's a selenium. Mine's dead as a doornail. Has been since I got it. But you know what? It still looks nice. Over on the back, you have your combined viewfinder rangefinder, and the Contax III and II were actually the first cameras to actually have those. So it's a nice little thing. The one annoyance is right over here. This is your PC sync socket for when you're using either battery powered flash or flash bulbs. The trouble is that if your face is too close to this, you will get a tiny little shock. And then on the bottom, you have a standard tripod socket. There's your rewind sprocket release, and then the 2 keys to release the whole back. And that's it. It's a simple camera, all mechanical, nothing automatic about it, nothing coupled about it, except for the rangefinder, thank goodness. So let's take a closer look on how the camera itself functions. Okay, so the first step is actually loading the film. Now, unlike Leicas of the era, the Contax makes itself different because you actually have to remove the entire back. So you flip your 2 keys on the bottom, and you twist them opposite of each other, and the entire back comes back. Now set this aside and make sure you don't lose it. And inside we have here the a standard internal compartment. You get a beautiful shot of that wonderful roll-up garage shutter curtain. You have your take-up spool here. Now this does come out, so you do want to be extra careful when loading and unloading film that you don't lose this. Finding a replacement is impossible at the worst, very difficult at the least. Your cartridge goes in here, you bring your film leader across and you tuck it into the metal cylinder. Click and advance forward, make sure everything's engaged on both sides, and then you close the camera back up. Boom. Twist, twist. And if you're used to Nikon rangefinders or the Nikon F, this is very familiar to you. Once there, bring it ahead a couple, and then simply reset your shutter, your frame counter to 1, and you're off to the races. Now, if you're lucky in the sense that your camera has a working selenium meter to take a reading, you pop open the front, and then you simply match the needle using your settings right over here, making sure your film speed is set, then set your desired aperture, and then your shutter speed until the needle moves right into the middle there. And then you can close it up to protect your selenium meter. There is no composition lines, so you sort of have to guess, but you look through here to set your focus. And then for focusing is actually done through this knob, this dial up at the front. Press down here to release from infinity lock, and then you can happily focus away. And because the focusing helical is actually on the camera body itself, you can actually get in pretty close focus. So next is, of course, once you've finished shooting your roll, you need to rewind. So down on the bottom, you press and hold down the sprocket release, and that you have to keep a firm hold on. And then you pull out your rewind knob up here and twist away until it actually releases. Now, a couple things that are interesting. There is no standard lever. It is, of course, a knob-based advance, but with enough practice, this is actually pretty fast. It does take several turns for everything to do, but at least it also cocks the shutter at the same time. Swapping out lenses, you have a release tab right up here. You simply press that down, you twist your lens, and you pull it out. And the same thing, you match this little tab up here with the red dot. Sometimes takes a bit, and then simply twist, pop, and you're good to go. One thing to also note is that some lenses are collapsible, which means they can bring themselves down into the camera body. It's important that you bring them out and lock them into place before you actually start shooting it. Well, that's the basics for the Contax IIIa. Let's take it back out into the field, and I can tell you a little bit about an SLR guy's experience with shooting a mid-century rangefinder.
Okay, so today we are in beautiful Oakville, Ontario, in a beautiful winter wonderland. I have my Contax IIIa with the Zeiss Opton Sonar 50mm f1.5 lens, probably the best lens I own for this camera, and it's loaded with Kentmere 400 which I'll be developing in 510 Pyro at a 1:100 dilution, constant rotation. So let's get walking, and I can talk a little bit about my experience as an SLR guy with a 50s rangefinder. Let's do this. As someone who loves working with SLRs, the Contax IIIa offers up an experience that I can really get behind. And that's probably because most of my previous experience with mid-century rangefinders have been with Barnack Leicas. I never really got into a groove with them, but the Contax IIIa offers up something a little more familiar, especially if you're used to working with the Nikon F. You do have to remove the entire back to load film, which can get annoying. Yeah, it's almost entirely manual. A lot of things that you're familiar with aren't there, but once you get into the groove with the camera, it's actually really enjoyable. The number one thing I really like is that the rangefinder and viewfinder are on a single combined window, which despite the age of mine is actually still bright and plenty of contrast left in that rangefinder patch. The camera itself is very well laid out. It's comfortable in the hand. You don't need a heavy strap to be able to carry it comfortably, and not having to actually use the lens barrel to focus is actually really nice because it allows you to one-handed focus and then quickly move your finger to the shutter release button. Of course, with all these extra steps needed, I can actually see why a lot of professional photographers would carry a pair of these already loaded into the field. The Contax IIIa offers up a unique experience that will definitely make you appreciate a lot of the modern conveniences we have in our cameras today. But of course, we all know that the main power of a Zeiss Ikon camera is of course the optics. And unlike some of my other Zeiss Ikon cameras, I actually have Carl Zeiss optics for my IIIa. But that's not the only lens I've had, and I have a lot less than I did when I started. So let's go back to the studio. I can look back at some of the lenses I have, and more importantly, the two that I still use today. And I will see you back at the park.
The biggest argument between camera nerds is which optics are better, Zeiss or Leitz? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and say both are about equal in my books. I've shot both Leica cameras and Contax cameras, Leitz optics and Zeiss optics, and really, for the average person, you can barely tell the difference between the two. And that's the one thing that truly makes the Contax one of my favorite Zeiss Ikon cameras in my collection, is that I actually have true Zeiss optics for this camera. In fact, the two lenses I have are, one's newer, one's older, but both are Carl Zeiss branded optics. So when I first got the camera, I got it with three lenses from John. I got the Sonar 50 f1.5, a Jupiter 8 50 f2 and a Jupiter 9 85mm f2. So the lens that I actually use the most on this camera is the Zeiss Opton Sonar 50mm f1.5. This is a beautiful piece of glass for this camera, and it basically lives 95% of the time on the camera. I've never had a bad image out of it. It's a beautiful piece of glass, and it has a very unique aperture opening and close, almost a saw blade, I would describe it as. The image qualities are spectacular. If you've shot sonar lenses before, they are fast, they are spectacular, they're incredibly sharp, they have a beautiful out of focus rendering, and they really perform well at every aperture. The second 50mm lens I had for this camera was a Jupiter 8 50mm f2. This is a lens that I no longer have. And again, if it's all you have for your contacts, then it's definitely worthwhile to shoot. Well built, optically excellent, again, beautiful out of focus rendering. It is based on an older sonar design, which is why it only opens up to f2, but still, well worth your time and effort. One of the most interesting lenses I had was the Jupiter 9, an 85mm f2. And if you're into swirly out of focus rendering, then this is the lens for you. It certainly did perform well the one time that I used it, and it just got super annoying to mount. So I only used it one time. I ended up giving away both the Jupiter 8 and the Jupiter 9 to another member of the Toronto Film Shooters group, someone who had gotten their hands on a Kiev rangefinder but lacked any good optics for it. In fact, it came with one busted lens. So I wasn't using the Jupiter glass on my Contax IIIa, so I just gave him the lenses. The second lens that I still have today is a Carl Zeiss Jena 50mm f2 Tessar. Now the Tessar is a triplet design, a fabulous lens design, and this one's a little bit hazy, so I tend to use it when shooting historical events just to give it a more classic appearance. It's a collapsible lens, so I do need to remember to pull it out from the camera body and lock it into place before I use it. It opens up to f3.5, so not exactly fast, but it certainly has a classic quality to it. And it is again one that I'm going to stick completely to myself. And if the 3A ever dies, it will proudly sit next to it because, again, it's just a wonderful old lens. I think I got it from my good friend Trevor Black on a non-functioning Contax II. Now, the one thing that I did mention is the Contax IIIa has a dual lens mount. It has an internal bayonet and an external bayonet. And the Jupiter 9 was one of those lenses that actually used both the internal bayonet and the external bayonet, and it made it an absolute bear to mount on the camera. Thankfully, both the Tessar and the Sonar lenses that I have use only the internal bayonet, so it is a lot easier to mount. Now, again, as I've mentioned, the Contax IIIa does have the focusing helical in the body itself, so it makes it very difficult to actually adapt these lenses to your mirrorless system. But there is an adapter available that takes your Contax RF mount and turns it into a Leica M mount, and most importantly, it does include the focusing helical option, so you can actually focus the lens. And from the Leica M mount, you can then easily adapt it to your Nikon Z mount, your Canon mirrorless mount, and of course the ever popular Sony E mount. The lenses are expensive, especially when you go with Carl Zeiss optics, and you do have to watch out for pre-war lenses. Certain 35mm focal length lenses, both Russian and German, have a very long back element, and if you do mount them on the camera, it will cause damage to your shutter if you're mounting it onto post-war cameras.
Well, that about covers it for this review. I love the IIIa. It's the only rangefinder I've really gotten to know and can really use effectively. And despite its age and its various problems, it's one that I don't want to get rid of. For the simple matter is I still have that dream of putting together a World War II combat photographer impression. And despite being a post-war camera, looks enough like a pre-war camera that at 40 yards, most people aren't going to know the difference. And the reenactors, well, they might be aware of it, will probably love the fact that I'll be shooting on traditional black and white film, much like those who did during the Second World War. And therein lies one of the biggest problems with this camera is that its age. Mine traces itself back to 1953, and they're starting to crop up a few problems here and there. I could probably do with a good shutter service to make sure all the speeds are accurate, a good lubrication of all the moving parts, and of course aligning the rangefinder. But because this is a Zeiss Ikon camera, it is precision engineered, and finding someone to repair it is difficult but not impossible. There are plenty of people out there who are learning the skills and have the tools and the spare parts and the patience to do it in a professional manner. It's just a matter of seeking them out. And the good news is that my good friend Mike Ekman and Theo over on the Camerosity podcast have actually talked to somebody. So if you want to know a little bit more about Zeiss Ikon Contax, check the link in the description below to the appropriate episode. And the best part is you can always call in and be a part of the podcast as well. On the used market, you can get a camera body and a lens, usually this either a Sonar 50 f2 or the 51.5 like I have, for between $400 to $600. There are some on the outlying areas, but make sure to read the description and make sure you're prepared to pay a little bit more to get the camera serviced if necessary. And that's it. Have you worked with Contax rangefinders before? Are you a rangefinder person who has one SLR that they really like and get along with? Or are you like me and vice versa? Let me know in the comments below your thoughts. And as always, my name's Alex, so get out there, stay safe, get to cover.
Hey there, friends. Thanks for sticking with it to the very end, or, just skipping to this point. Just wanted to give a bit of a couple of housekeeping announcements for the channel. First of all, back in January, I did manage to hit over 1,000 subscribers, so thank you so much for everyone who continues to subscribe, like, comment on these videos. It truly means a lot to me. Second, I'd like to state that through April into September of this year, that I'll be moving down to a single video each month. The reason being, I'm not going to have as much time to be able to get out and to produce 2 videos a month, but there is content in the can waiting to be released throughout April, May, June, July, August, and September. And then hopefully through the last 3 months of the year, I can kick it back to 2 videos, but stay tuned for that. All right, take care of yourselves.